get into the panel today, which we have instead of a presenter. So we're going to have a panel on legal resources for businesses with Lisa County from Connect Business Magazine moderating.
Hey, Lisa, I'm gonna
unmute you here.
Unmute you, yeah.
You're gonna need to unmute on your end, Lisa.
What I said was really good too, and you all missed it. Now I got to start all over. It was good to see everyone. And I'm going to start just by quickly introducing our three panelists today. We're very lucky to have them here with their experience and their wisdom that they'll be imparting to us. Before I introduce the panelists, I want everyone in the audience, I'm sure you all might have a lot of questions about your particular situation, and today won't really be a day to help solve some of those specific questions or issues, but we're going to hope to leave you with some resources and answer some of your general questions so that moving forward, it'll sort of give you an idea of how to navigate all of that. So our panelists today, we have with us Paul Schneider, who's a partner with Bluth & Behrens. He has experience in small business and real estate law, and he's also a volunteer with Legal Corps, which I think will be a good resource for everyone, and we'll hear more about that in just a few minutes. We also have joining us Wade Davis of Davis Legal Consulting. He is a professor of business law at Minnesota State here in Mankato. And then also Matt Lessard joins us. He's an executive leader and an entrepreneur. He has a lot of experience on both the business development, private equity side, and international business experience as well. So he can bring a perspective from both the corporate development side and also the investor side of things. So let's start with Paul, if Paul is on today, and you're going to tell us a little bit more about Legal Corps. Paul?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. I'm Paul Schneider. I am an attorney at Bluth & Behrens, here today in my capacity as a Legal Corps volunteer. Legal Corps is a nonprofit based out of Minneapolis that helps small businesses and nonprofits with their legal needs on really a proactive basis. Some of the more traditional nonprofits that you hear of in the legal field, like the Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, what people refer to as legal aid, a lot of those are all focused on helping usually low-income people on the back end if they're in the court system or if they need help. And so Legal Corps was formed to try and help businesses and small business owners and nonprofits on the front end with some proactive advice. They've got about 500 attorneys on their roster who will help businesses and nonprofits with non-litigation matters. And so a lot of times they help with entity formation, lease review, helping draft contracts, things like that, that a lot of small businesses and nonprofits need to get up and running and get themselves off on the right foot. They have two primary modes of delivering their services. The first is a brief advice clinic. They have these throughout the state. We have them in Mankato. I forget, Mike, if it's actually the SBDC or who hosts it within Mankato, but it's in the same location, right, Mike?
Yep, it's hosted by the SBDC, and it's located in the Hubbard building.
And that takes place about every couple weeks, I believe, and there are local attorneys that come and staff it. Mike, is it every couple weeks?
Yep, it's the, excuse me, first and third Thursdays of the month. So, and if you go to our website at myminnesotabusiness.com, under services, you will find the Legal Corps tab and you can schedule the appointment from there.
And it is by appointment. It is, exactly as it sounds. It's brief advice. It's, 20 or 30 minutes to meet with a lawyer and just kind of talk through some issues. Obviously in 20 or 30 minutes, you can't necessarily get full in-depth analysis or advice or anything, but it can help spot some issues, which will lead into kind of where we go from here. But the second piece with Legal Corps is they do have the opportunity to provide full representation. And so this would be business attorneys taking on someone on what we would truly consider a pro bono basis, kind of start to finish, and help them either with a specific legal task or a couple different things. So that's a little bit about Legal Core. I can certainly go into more depth on any of that if anybody's interested. But I'll pause here and see if there's any questions or comments.
I do have one quick question. Paul, does a business have to qualify in some way, or is it open to anyone?
Great question. There are income requirements, but especially right now with the COVID pandemic and being based out of Minneapolis, Legal Core has seen and filled a variety of needs based on the recent protests up there. And so while there are income limits, they're a little more flexible right now. And I think there are usually some exceptions. And so while it is targeted towards small businesses and people with limited income, I would encourage everybody to apply and call in and see if it's available to them.
Okay, thanks, Paul, for that. And we can come back to that if there are more questions. If you do have questions, any of you that are on, go ahead and send them in the chat, and Mike, Con, and I will sort of sort those out, and I'll ask them as we get them in. Next up, we have Wade Davis, who's going to touch on some maybe online resources. Good morning, Wade.
Good morning, and I apologize that I'm not, you can't see my face. Our internet went out where we were at up north yesterday, and so I'm on the phone with you. You know, two questions that I was asked to talk about were different legal forms and documents, where you might find them, how you would use them, and some steps about finding an attorney. And I'm just going to give a couple of brief comments, and I'd be glad to answer questions in the back end. On the legal form and document side, I think that we've seen an explosion of different companies that are trying to figure out how to create, you know, a system that allows people to get access to forms that are generic, but somewhat specific. And, you know, for example, LegalZoom. And if you just go on to the, you know, a LegalZoom website and look around, you'll see that they'll have all sorts of different substantive areas of law, from formation to employment to, you know, independent contractor type documents. And that in order to get access to those, you have to pay to get access to those. There are some other sources where you can get good legal forms and good documents to start with. You always want to start with your industry organization. And so to the extent that you belong to an industry organization, or, you know, Society for Human Resource, or, if, you know, folks that are in farming or co-op, or whatever sales organizations you're in, oftentimes they will have resources that are available to their members, and those resources will be more content and substantive specific. The third place where you can get online forms are going to be through the Minnesota Court website. And I have to say that of all the websites I've seen, Minnesota Courts are some of the best. And for the most part, most of those documents are going to be process and litigation oriented. And so there are some other just non-process documents, but for example, if you're in conciliation court or collections is another place. And then the final thing that I would say, as far as being specific in Minnesota and you know, specific to a lot of different areas of law, is the Minnesota CLE, which is where it mostly serves Minnesota lawyers, and they have quite a few workbooks, documents, and model documents. So LegalZoom, industry organizations, Minnesota Courts, and this Minnesota CLE. And what I think when I think about getting legal forms is what they're useful for. And we have to remember a couple of things. Or one is that, you know, the law is going to depend state by state and sometimes municipality by municipality. And so what a generic form that might work one place definitely will not work in other places. That the law changes, and it needs to, your documents need to reflect kind of up-to-date changes in the law, and those are often, you know, happening and very dynamic. And the third thing is that the documents that we create really are fact-specific, that depend on what you need and what you want. And so, you know, it's really important to put those forms into context. And a couple of things I would say about the forms is that, you know, they're a good starting point, especially for people who don't know about kind of that area of law or what that would look like. They often are really good at issue spotting to make you think about who the parties are and what the terms are. And they're often wrong. And when I say that is that they're either wrong from a jurisdictional legal perspective, they're wrong from a terminology perspective, or they're wrong because they just don't fit your facts. And so while they might get you to third base, that you just really need to make sure that you slow down and kind of make sure that the form fits what you want. And, as an attorney, and I assume that Matt and Paul would be able to attest this, when my clients come to me with generic documents out of the gate, oftentimes it takes a lot more time for me to get that into a form that works for what they need than the documents I have to start with, or more often, or as often, people started with those generic documents and they're ready to evolve past those. And that's kind of where the attorneys come in. And so I guess you can use these as well as you can, but I think that you need to make sure that you slow down and as they get more important, that you're able to go and make sure you get an expert set of eyes on them to give you some feedback. The second comment that I was asked to talk about, or just how do you find an attorney and how do you kind of approach an attorney? And I'd always say that you want to stop and ask, what do you need? I mean, where are you at? Are you looking for just a specific issue? Do you need an independent contractor agreement? Do you need a specialist to help you with real estate or employment or corporate law? Or do you need somebody who's more of a counselor, i.e. somebody who has business experience and is able to help you identify problems, help you figure out what the next step is, and to kind of help you plan? And those are all questions that are going to help kind of guide you and what you're going to look for in an attorney at the end of the day. I would say that fit is really important. It's most important for a personality perspective, that if you're going to work with somebody who's going to be your counselor, you're going to want to trust them and have a similar kind of approach towards life and business. You want to ask yourself, would you need somebody with really specific experience or expertise? There are certified specialists, for example, in employment law that you can find through the Minnesota State Bar Association. Do you want somebody who's going to be just a solo, or somebody who's going to be part of a bigger firm? As you get more complicated, they can turn to expertise, and you're going to want to find somebody who can create a financial arrangement that is one that works with you. And so those are things as far as fit that you want to ask when you're sort of preparing to kind of decide who to be your lawyer. The third thing then is that we kind of know sort of what issues we're looking for is how do you find a lawyer? And, I'd say it really kind of depends. And, my starting point that I always tell people is, you should try to figure out your legal community. And that's really easy to do that through, just some online searches, and you'll realize, okay, we've got 3 to 5 firms just locally that have 10 to 30 lawyers in them. They're kind of generalists. They do everything. We have a set of folks that are smaller, and we have one firm in town that has part of a much bigger office that has several hundred attorneys. And so it would only take you 40 minutes, I think, to get a lay of the land. But I always think that people should ask their bankers and their accountants, because as a banker who's financing you and accountants who's kind of knows what your legal issues are, they're regularly working with attorneys, and they'd be able to think of other attorneys that would be kind of at the level that you're looking for. I think folks should talk to other businesses oftentimes, and they should be very willing to just meet with attorneys to talk. The final thing is that, as you go to these industry type of events that are in your area, or things like, A Million Cups, that you'll be able to kind of see different lawyers and see their approach. And don't be afraid to talk to them and ask them questions. They're all very, very, very helpful in my experience. And they do this in part to stay on top of the law, but stay connected to the community, and gives you a sense of them. And so I'd be glad to come back and talk about these two kind of areas or any other areas, but those are my 2 cents on how do you go about sort of looking for just generic kind of legal forms and online resources, and what are your first steps as far as finding and identifying and connecting with an attorney.
Well, yes. Thank you for all that, Wade. And we'll get back to some of those points again in a little bit. But I want to go on to our third panelist now, who is Matt. And Matt, you have experience with what they're talking about because you've started companies and then you've also helped them go through the business development. So what resources or tips do you have for us today?
Yeah, no, thanks, Lisa. And one thing about getting to discuss today, and I've been actually came on with SBDC as a consultant this year too, and which has been great because I like to pass on, knowledge hopefully that I would have liked to have had 20 years ago sometimes, right? So I appreciate that, especially starting businesses and such. To me, first and foremost, I break it down, kind of almost like a little business plan, right? First and foremost, budget, understand what resources you have to bring on some legal assistance. With anything, you budget and understand kind of so you can get that good legal assistance when you find it. I've always networked, so that's through friends of mine, business partners of mine, former workers, lawyers, bankers, to find, legal side, accounting side, everything that I want to go interview and discuss with, because I want to get some names and local and regional firms, and then I go and interview them. I want my legal help to think of being my partner for the next 10 years. And I've always go set up meetings, and it's always been, what I've always found is any lawyer I've ever hired has given me a half hour to hour just to understand me and I understand them, to understand if we'd be a good partner together. And so you really gotta, and that means their experience. Have they worked on these type of deals? Can they grow with you? Can they offer, as Wade said, to other resources within their firm when you get into intellectual property or certain type of contracts? You want somebody that can grow with you eventually. And you want to feel like a partner. My best lawyers that I've ever worked with, you feel like they're in the deal with you and they're a partner and they're invested in it, right? So that always feels like they're part of your team, and that's to me the best. I've sat on the investor side too. So I've been an investor in businesses and as well. So entrepreneur side, you're trying to build your team. As an investor, if you're looking out there to raise capital, the investor should tell you to get good legal help. I've been on the side where I've had to tell entrepreneurs, listen, I know your Uncle Harry's a great lawyer, but in this town or this there, but go get a firm that has the experience, because we're going to waste more time arguing over points that really aren't important for this deal than you have somebody who's a good, competent lawyer. And lastly, and Wade brought up some good points on LegalZoom and such. A lot of times entrepreneurs are just trying to get that tax ID, get a checking account, get things rolling, and just so they can sign some legal agreements, sign NDAs. You don't want to sign an NDA just on your personal self. You want it to be tied to something else. At least that's my opinion. I'm not the lawyer on the group here, but so at the end of the day, I use LegalZoom. I mean, I raised almost $20 million, and I started out on LegalZoom, and then I took those to a lawyer, and then they shaped them like Wade was talking about. And so the LegalZoom side gets you rolling, gets you some form of legal entity, make you put a name on it, but then you get it shaped for the situation with a lawyer. So so that's what I've done in the standpoint of entrepreneurship and on the investor side. So it's just about really finding out what you need and making sure you're ready to write the check for it as well too.
Now, at what step in the process do you need to seek out a lawyer? Is it right away? Is it once you've got some things established, or when do you know when you need one before it's too late?
From my standpoint, it's very early because you're gonna have to form a legal entity, and you want to start building a relationship with somebody, and at least understand who is going to be your lawyer. If you don't have the funds or that you don't feel right to jump in, build a relationship with somebody. Say, listen, when this thing kicks in, I need you to be on my team. But also, here's the steps I'm doing. Is there anything I'm doing wrong right now? Just from the standpoint of, like Paul said, of forming if you're getting some legal corp or some other advice. But I believe early on, when you can do it, you should.
Okay. A question from the audience now is, what should a new business person do to prepare for the legal appointment that may help them decrease their cost and increase effectiveness? So how do you prepare for that first trip to your attorney?
Paul, you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll jump in. Well, I think the most important thing is really thinking about what this looks like from a business perspective. And I fully realize that you have a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, because you might not know what this looks like from a legal perspective or a business But to the extent you can come with a business plan that talks about what is your idea, what does this look like in terms of how many owners you're going to have, how many managers, what your operations look like, what kind of funding you might need, are you going to have paid employees? Is it going to be contractors? Really looking at kind of what the business is first. And to the extent you can group those into buckets, that will help lawyers like me, who, I primarily handle business law, and a lot of the formation and capitalization and financing and things like that. It'll help me know if I need to bring on one of my employment law colleagues or one of my colleagues who can help with IP or something like that. But the biggest thing I see from my end of things is trying to figure out, especially with business partners, what's the deal that you guys have reached? What's the relationship that you envision? Because I see a number of businesses get formed just kind of, on a handshake, and, either it goes poorly or it goes just gangbusters. And all of a sudden one partner is going, well, I should get a lot more of what we did because I worked a lot harder for that. And that is one of the things that, I'll be quite candid, keeps the lights on at our office when people start fighting. So if you can get that ahead of time and just figure out, what does this look like? That gives us a lot more to start from and really help at that initial or second meeting. Wade, do you have any thoughts?
I think about bigger pictures, like who's going to control the company, who's going to own the company, the specific things that are keeping you up at night. I think that oftentimes if you can kind of come in with priority of kind of topics that you're worried about, and some of them are just the next step, and some of them are big picture, and to the extent that you have something that you're trying to solve a problem in particular, that you'll want to make sure you get good timelines and a good cast of characters. Those are the two things as a litigator I always needed. I needed to know when things started and what happened and who that was involved. And then kind of if there are any specific documents. But once you go in, then you can kind of work with whoever you're working with to figure out how you're going to tackle those. And, I think, most good attorneys, if you're talking with them and they realize that, boy, this is not the best fit just because you need somebody who's going to allow you to be a little bit freer, a little less expensive, or you're going to need somebody who's more of a specialist, that they will kind of help you identify the best fit if it's not them. And so, I guess from those 2 points of view, those are some things that I would think about going in to meet with an attorney. But just remember that it's not, especially at the beginning, it's not a marriage. It's trying to find somebody who you're going to work well with and who's going to think about your problems as much as you think about your problems and come to you with solutions and kind of bigger questions and put things in perspective. And if you sort of approach your lawyer that way, I think you end up in the sort of team mentality that Bobby was talking about that really does help you in the long run.
Okay, great. Thank you for all of that. Now we have a question from Brad. He said, you read an article regarding businesses starting to require COVID-19 releases for their employees. And the article's commentary was that that was a wrong approach. Just curious, Brad, is what the panel thinks about this issue.
I guess there's a lot of different issues just a lot of issues with COVID-19, but, for the most part, if an employee is doing their work and they get injured or ill because of their work, that's going to be covered under a workers' compensation type of arrangement. If they're independent contractors, it's going to be different. And so, the questions that I would have are, what's the nature of a release? What are the nature of the instructions? I could see the employer saying, look, these are our health guidelines that you have to follow, and, you're required to follow them, and having them sign off on those. The other side, as far as what a release would say, is that if you were to get ill because you're working, it's not on us. I don't know how effective that would be.
All right. Okay, so another question that's popped up. First, a reminder: if you do have a question for the panel, just raise your hand or put it in chat, and we'll try to get it on here for you. But another question might be when you're trying to budget for legal services and legal help. How do you, when you're initially putting together your business plan, how do you know how much or what to budget for that type of thing? I know I'm sure it varies greatly.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's critical on the budgeting side, and really, how I've always budgeted things, I would speak with my lawyer and say, listen, we're going to do a joint venture agreement, right? And that's a big agreement. What's your estimated cost on that? Can you give me an estimate? And I've done a lot where I do project pricing where I say, okay, it's $10,000 to do this. It may take you 5 hours to do it, but it may take you 100 hours to do it. But I have 10 grand I need to put towards this and we need to get it done. Does that work for you? And so I've done project budgeting. So I know how much money I have, I'm going to put on something and make sure I agree with it. And then also, and so that's, and then understand from other individuals and really talk to your lawyer.
Yeah, and I would agree with Matt. I mean, I don't think there's any shame in just coming right up and saying, hey, look, here's what I'm looking to spend. Is this doable? Because I will tell you, if somebody comes to me and says, I got a $10,000 deal versus 100,000 versus $1 million versus 10 million, it impacts the scope of our work. And it's very helpful for us on the front end to know what kind of you're looking for from a budget perspective. But in terms, Lisa, of trying to build it in your business plan, really depends what you're looking for. I mean, the scope of work could change depending on, as Matt said, if it's project by project or if it's, look, we got to run the whole gamut on a whole bunch of different issues. Obviously, that's going to change. And that's why I think just having an open and upfront conversation about it is very helpful.
And I think this is where Bobby talked about networking and talking with folks and talking with other businesses and talking with your attorneys and just processing some of your problems out loud or questions out loud, and to see where other entrepreneurs and people who've been through this, what they can tell you as far as guidelines. And, I think Paul will be able to tell you, even as far as simple organization, you're going to get different costs and prices across the board from different lawyers. But there will be some times where you're going to have lawyers who are going to be billing at much higher rates, but are going to be able to add a lot more value just because of their experience and background and the number of folks working behind the scenes. And sometimes those folks are going to be just way overpriced for what you need. And so I do think just asking those frank questions and being able to push a little bit and just clarify those budget issues. It's fair for the consumer, it's fair for the client to have those questions, and those conversations, as Paul says, are going to often be defined by the scope of the work.
Okay, and I do have a question for Paul regarding Legal Core. Someone's asking if there's help for getting patents through Legal Core, and if not, what do you recommend in maneuvering through that patent process?
There is, and I apologize. This is something that's relatively new. It was not around when I first started Legal Core, and I'll admit I do not have much experience with this, because when you start getting into the patent realm, usually those attorneys, in addition to their law degree, have some sort of at least a master's and usually some sort of doctorate in some form of specific engineering. But Legal Core does have what they call the Inventor Assistance Program that can help connect entrepreneurs with patent attorneys to try and get patents. Now, whether it's a provisional patent or a full patent, that's where they can help define that and figure out if they can connect an entrepreneur with the right attorney who can help in that regard.
Okay. And Matt, have you had experience with this? I know that you've had some technology patents perhaps through your experiences.
Yeah, I have a license agreement with a large company for a technology that I took to Brazil. And that license agreement's off of know-how, not off of patents. And that company didn't patent it because it's such an easy process that once you patent it, they would figure it out, right? It's one that could be easily understood, and actually then you got to start suing people. And I've been on the side as an investor where we put $37.5 million in a firm I worked in into a telecom company. And we had a multi-billion-dollar company come in and say, your patents, we're gonna do what we want. and they knew we weren't going to spend $5 million in legal fees. So we ended up negotiating a settlement on royalties. So what I tell entrepreneurs is, why do you want a patent? First, really think about it, because there's intellectual property and then there's patents. And sometimes a patent, entrepreneurs feel that, you know, to me at least, they go, oh, they want to hold on to that patent, and they think, oh, geez, once I have that, nobody's going to get through my stuff. There's companies out there that have teams of people looking to get around your patent that are far more bigger and stronger than you, and they will get around it most of the time. And then you're going to end up trying to negotiate a royalty deal or something. So what I tell people is, you can look at patent searches yourself. You can look online and see what patents are similar to your technology. At the end of the day, develop your product, develop your technology, get your non-disclosure agreements together, and get working on your company, because a patent can cost you 10 to 50 grand to get done. And you spend a lot of time and resources thinking you get this magic thing that's going to protect you from everything. Well, it won't. So focus on your intellectual property or technology. If you feel this patent is that unique, legal services are generally far more expensive to do patents. Like Paul said, they're specialized. You go to a large firm and they'll give you one guy, and somewhere else, this is our patent guy, and it is 2 to 3 times the hourly rate. Mm-hmm. So really understand as an entrepreneur, do you need this patent at this moment? You can plan to have it some other day, but you can utilize non-disclosure agreements and other legal forms to protect your technology. Like I said, I have a technology license agreement for know-how. And that's a strange thing to say, but the know-how is connected to the technology. So,
good, great advice there, Matt. Thank you. Another question here: for the average new business in Southern Minnesota, what do all of you believe would be the categories of law that are most helpful for them to get advice about? Would it be human resources, business formation, contract creation? Just kind of knowing our climate here, what do you think would be the big topics? Who should we start with?
I think that you're touching on. I think as an employment guy, that you probably want to have your employment documents and processes in place, and it'll be helpful to have somebody who knows about employment law. And you know, oftentimes with things changing, you're going to have somebody who's a bit more of a specialist. But once you have, you know, handbooks in order, and you kind of have your various policies, and you recognize what those laws are, and you're able to make sure that you're following them, and, you know, to the extent you need to training your management on them, that's going to be one that'll be helpful for you just to set up your employer relationship. And so that's one category I would say that it would be helpful. The other one is,
go ahead, Wade.
Go ahead, guys. I would say the other thing is that you want to ask what your key contracts are, and make sure that those contracts are written in a way that are favorable to you. So if you're selling services or products, or you know, you have some other type of contractual arrangement, that those documents are tight for you, and you recognize where they could change and what's going to be beneficial terms to you versus you know, terms that aren't as beneficial. And so getting your core contract documents together is a second area.
Yeah, I mean, well, go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
Oh, I say, Matt, jump in.
Well, to me, first and foremost, when you're starting a company, learn how you're slicing the pie up, right? If you have other partners, get your corporate governance in place, meaning, and as Paul said, that's where the fighting starts, right? And good and bad side, right? It's pointing the finger if it's going bad, or if it's grabbing for that piece of pie when it's going well. So what I tell people, if you have a partner or an investor eventually, obviously, get your corporate governance in place, get your, you know, not just the titles, but how does this all work? When am I going to go out? When are we going to exit? It's odd to talk about disagreements when you're just starting with a partnership. You're thinking, we're buddies, you know, we're great, we're going to conquer the world together. Well, you got to prepare for all contingencies. So to me, it's that corporate governance side, those initial documents in the company, and then you'll have your operating documents you got to get in place too. So.
Yeah, and I would echo what Wade and Matt said. I mean, from my perspective, I see the corporate disputes, the ownership disputes. I mean, that is what I see most frequently. And it's because people did not take the time on the front end. They were so busy working in the business, they didn't have time to work on the business. And they didn't think about what might happen, whether it's good or bad, to try and help get people in and out, you know, if they got to bring on investors or otherwise.
Yep.
But like Wade said, I mean, the number one thing that I get my partners involved in is when somebody's bringing on their first employee, because as soon as you bring on your first employee, there are just a host of laws and regulations that you now become subject to that you were not otherwise subject to. And that is, it can just open up kind of Pandora's box. And those are very specific regulations. And I will be the first to admit, I know there is employment laws out there. I am not the person to answer them. And so that's when we bring in specialists. The other thing that I see, and this may just be a piece based on my practice areas, I would add real estate to the list, because in addition to operations, most people need space, whether it's a lease, whether they're buying something. That's one of the things that I get a lot of questions on, because either they're leasing a whole bunch of space or they're going to go buy a piece of property. And then that raises questions on financing and otherwise. And so that again ties back into the governing documents. So that's my take.
Well, good. And we do have this question from the audience that was touched on earlier, but what's a good way for a small business to know when a lawyer is needed and when something can be done in-house or through category experts?
I mean, from my standpoint, you should know your own comfort zone and your experience. You know, I have maybe a higher comfort zone in some, you know, if I look at a non-disclosure agreement, I don't need my lawyer to look at that. Some people should have their lawyer look at that at all times. I can sign, you know, I'm comfortable through experience. But to me, if you're an entrepreneur and you're sitting there and you're thinking, you know, and it's something that has potential liability or legal ramifications, financial for your business, take 15 minutes to talk to your lawyer about it. You may thank yourself one day and go, gee, I'm glad I picked up the phone, and it may be a little charge for that, and it should be, but man, it paid huge dividends.
Did Paul or Wade anything to add?
I would echo Matt. I mean, I've got clients who, quite frankly, they're so busy, they just want me to do things that they really don't need a lawyer for. And then I've got some very sophisticated clients that, you know, quite frankly, they're the ones negotiating the documents and we're doing a final review because, as Matt said, they're just comfortable doing that. Yep. And so it really depends on your comfort level and what you're looking for from that lawyer.
And from my point of view, it's just asking what is the purpose of that document or the arrangement that you're working on. Is it going to be repeated over time? Does it open up potential liability? And to ask sort of the bigger questions and ask your comfort level, and then, you know, go from there if it feels like any of those answers are yes. And those are, I agree with Bobby in the sense of those are things that you can sort of, once you have a lawyer, can talk just big picture about their thoughts on it. And, you know, you may be able to reach out an arrangement if, you know, it seems like it's easy and not important to maybe just get a second set of eyes for 15, 20 minutes on it, or all the way up to, you know, this is going to be something that's going to be a standard document that we're going to use across the board, then maybe it's worth spending a little more time on it with a lawyer.
And this question came in for Paul, but I'm sure it's something that you all have experience with. He asks, is COVID-19 creating new or unique legal issues?
Yes, it is. You know, I'd be interested in Wade's take on this too. I mean, the thing about COVID is it is so unprecedented. You know, there are so many things changing at such a quick pace. I mean, it was down to the point where I had clients calling me in March as one executive order came down from the governor on Monday, and then you get a second one on Tuesday, and it changed what just happened on Monday. And so the pace at which it is changing things is just, you know, astronomical. And the hard part is a lot of this has not been tested yet by the courts. And so while we can give advice, you know, to a certain extent, some of it is not bulletproof because we don't have guidance, we don't have a lot of precedence. And so we are trying to put our clients in the best position possible given the changing circumstances, with the caveat that, you know, they're changing all the time. And so absolutely, COVID is changing almost all aspects, whether it's leasing and real estate, contracts, employment. I've got vendors and supply contracts that, you know, are impacting operations. You've got financing issues with banks and the PPP loans. I mean, it's just touching almost every aspect of business right now. So Wade, what are you seeing?
I think at least at the initial, the big perspective is that when this happened, business as usual stopped. And the question then what happened is, are we excused from having to perform? For example, if I've got a lease and all of a sudden the mall is closed, do I have to pay the lease? If I generally order this amount of goods and I'm not going to need the goods, or someone's not going to be able to buy and sell them. So there's really a question on all of those contracts require some type of service or product to be sold or provided. And they can no longer be performed because no one's buying or selling, or the process is broken down, is whether they're excused or released from those obligations. That's kind of the key first question. And then running down from that, the way that business has changed, where employees have shifted from being at work to being at home, where, the amount of sales and et cetera, are down. And so across the board, there are a lot of legal issues, but one of the key ones, kind of this notion of force majeure, kind of act of God, releasing people from contracts, or other theories of frustration and impracticability, allowing people out of contracts, and a recognition that when one person doesn't perform and that's multiplied across the board, it affects its way up and down the chain. And so if you've got a lot of tenants that aren't paying rent, then you've got a lot of landlords that aren't paying mortgages, and then you got a lot of banks that and securities that are kind of owning those mortgages. You can play that out kind of across the board. And so this is also one of those moments where I think being a savvy business person and being able to go in and have those hard conversations at each level, you may be able to manage and kind of navigate all of that without kind of creating legal conflicts, but rather from a problem-solving perspective. And I think that this is a unique period where, to the extent that you can, that may be the best way to move through it.
And Matt, what are you seeing from your side of it? How has legal resources, how have they helped you through this time?
Sure. I mean, first quarter venture capital firms was a really good quarter. Second quarter, not as good, right? So if you're looking for capital, let's just on that. Venture capital firms have a timeline of money, right? They have to put money out there, so they're risk, they're risking themselves regardless. So people are still open on the capital side. I see there's a lot of opportunities out there as well. And I think as a business or an entrepreneur, this is a great time to understand risk assessment, right? And having a good legal team where you do have those outs in some contracts that you didn't think you'd ever need, but oh my goodness, I'm glad I have them now. And so part of it is this should be a really good time for people to understand, always understand that flip side of a deal, and make sure you can best position yourself if you have to back out of a significant contract.
That's good.
Yeah, for sure. This is one of those where if you had somebody who maybe over legal worked it on the front end and actually thought through all the problems that can happen, that you're going to be really well positioned when you go through this. And I have to say, I had a couple of cases where luckily the clients had great force majeure clauses that just released them from all their obligations when things fell apart. And so this was one of those times where, an ounce of prevention really helps, but this is also unforeseen. And so maybe it felt like more work, too much work at the front end, but it paid off.
I think we have time for one more question, and we'll go to Yvonne. Yvonne, did you have a question?
Well, in my years of experience, we found that there are occasionally customers we cannot please. You try your best and over, and you have issues with them. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about, and none of you have touched on this yet, is lawyer as, buffer between you and someone that you're perhaps having a dispute with. I had a situation and I tried to work it out, couldn't work it out with them. When I finally got smart and went and talked to my lawyer about it, he stepped in. I could go on with my business. And then he dealt with the person and cleaned it all up, and there was never a lawsuit or any problem or anything. So could you talk a little bit about that in terms of, and it's something that as I talk with new small business people, they don't often think of the lawyer as being kind of their champion and sort of stepping in. And truly my lawyer was my hero at that point, because I was laying awake at night worried about this situation. And suddenly I didn't have to worry about it anymore.
I can take that first. I mean, Yvonne, that's a great question. I've used, when I've had, for my side for lawyers, business can be emotional, right? I've had deals where certain things, it's not even just about the size of the money. It's you get into a business arrangement and it gets emotional because I get ticked off. You're like, what's going on here? And that can be an issue when you're trying to negotiate a settlement or a position. It's great to have a good lawyer on staff because they're not going to be emotionally connected to it. They're going to go in there pragmatically and hopefully solve the problem. So from my standpoint, it's always good to have that. That's why I say like they're a business partner, that they'll go in and solve this solution where I'm going to get angry or I'll get upset or I'll get into it because it's business and it gets emotional. So I use them as, somebody to go in and clean up a mess or, that I know I'll make worse because I'm not happy about it. Yeah.
And I guess it goes both ways because sometimes you bring lawyers in and they escalate the conflict, right? And so you get folks that are, it's sort of the style of the lawyer that are, going to be legalistic, and then all of a sudden there are a bunch of lawyers involved. And so it is, I think, as Paul said, by the time I was done with my just primary kind of legal career, that I felt like 70% of my job was to take problems off of businesses' shoulders and solve them so that they could go on with their work and that I could kind of work through their conflicts or just some whatever's nettlesome that they're dealing with. And I found that oftentimes if there is, a conflict, that having a letter that's on a letterhead from a lawyer will, get people to either be willing to sit down and resolve the conflict or recognize really what's at issue in the conflict. And so lawyers can be very important for helping you take things off your plate and as well as helping you work through kind of disagreements. But you want to have one that's going to be oriented and kind of thinking and approaching a bit similar, a similar style or strategies that you're used to or are comfortable with.
Yeah. And I would echo a lot of that. And one thing I would add, I think I have a lot of clients that might be in Matt's boat where they're very comfortable dealing with lawyers. And a number of my clients will be in communication with a lawyer for the other side. And then at some point, the switch will flip and all of a sudden it's no longer quite as amicable as it used to be. And so a lot of times that's when they'll bring me involved because then I can be the buffer for them. And so it is, that buffer on both sides, both from you with your customer and also from the other side with you. And there are ethical requirements that say if there's lawyers involved, I'm not supposed to talk to the other side. They're not supposed to talk directly. So it does.
And if you get two experienced lawyers, I'm sorry, Paul, if you get two experienced lawyers, oftentimes they're going to be focused on the problem and they'll be creative in being able to get it done. And so, it can be that it really does help short circuit and get to a much faster conclusion.
I mean, it's gentlemen, everybody just watch The Godfather 1 and you have a consigliere next to you. They take care of the problems. He's a lawyer too, if you remember from that movie. So that's what you need. You need somebody that's going to not escalate it, absolutely, but it's going to make it go away. Maybe not in the same form, obviously, but that will take care of that problem so you can hone in on your business and focus on other things and know it's in good hands, right?
Okay, well, Paul, Matt, and Wade, this was a wealth of information. I think we could fill another hour with this panel, but our time is up for today. Gary or Yvonne, is there a way for people to continue the conversation if they need to speak to someone after this?
Yeah, they can certainly send us a note and we can get the contact information for any of the panelists. I'll be happy to pass that along.
All right, good.
And
well,
just know that we're all happy to talk with you guys on various topics and that, at least Paul and Matt, I know are going to be free for part of this morning if people wanted to follow up with them with specific questions today.